When we talk about healing from complex PTSD, we often hear this thing like just forgive and forget, as if that's the answer, the magic solution. But digging into Pete Walker's work, especially in chapters 14 and 15, we're going to get into a much deeper understanding of what forgiveness really means, especially with trauma.
It's really spot on. What's so important about Walker's perspective is he really debunks this whole instant forgiveness thing as a starting point. He actually calls it premature forgiveness. It's like this idea that you can just decide to forgive often before, like, even starting to process the pain itself.
It's almost like, I don't know, putting a Band-Aid on a shattered bone.
Yeah.
Like trying to cover up something that needs serious attention without
Yeah.
actually dealing with the healing.
Exactly. And Walker's really clear that this like surface level forgiveness, it can actually do more harm than good because it kind of prevents you from going, okay, this hurt. You're not acknowledging the depth of it. It's only by actually going through that grieving process, letting yourself feel that anger, the sadness, that you can actually get to a place of genuine forgiveness.
And that's what he calls authentic forgiveness,
Yeah.
right? It's not saying, oh, it didn't happen or it doesn't matter. It's more about reaching a place of resolution within yourself.
Yeah, and what I find really interesting is how he connects this authentic forgiveness to anger. Because he says, by letting yourself fully experience and process that anger towards, whoever it was, the person who hurt you, it eventually loses its power over you. That's when forgiveness can kind of organically happen. But what's vital to remember, and Walker emphasizes this, is that forgiveness, it's really for you. It's for your own healing. It's not about, letting anyone off the hook for their actions.
And, that ties into something else he talks about, which is trying to understand the background of the people who caused us pain. Like our parents, for example, not to excuse anything, but to kind of get a fuller picture.
Right. So Walker talks about recognizing those struggles, maybe even traumas that our parents might have gone through themselves, and how sometimes that can lead to some compassion. Not sympathy for the bad things they did, but an understanding like, okay, this is part of how they became who they are.
It's like that saying, hurt people hurt people.
Yeah.
It doesn't justify anything, but it adds this whole other layer of complexity to their story.
Totally. And Walker's very careful to say, look, you can only really have that compassion, even in this limited way, after you've dealt with your own pain, your healing journey. That's what comes first. Your experience is valid no matter what, no matter the context of the person who hurt you.
As we were prepping for this deep dive, one thing that really stuck out to me was Walker's idea of bibliotherapy. Like, we've talked before about how much we both love to read,
Oh,
right?
right. Oh, for sure. Nothing beats curling up with a good book.
Totally. But this idea that reading can actually, like, help you heal, especially if you didn't have those supportive people in your life growing up, it just really resonated. It's like books can become these, like, companions,
Oh,
offering wisdom and comfort when you need it most.
yeah, it makes sense when you think about how isolating, complex PTSD can be. You might feel like nobody gets it, like what you went through is just like too much for other people. But then you find a book, maybe it's a poem, a memoir, whatever, and boom, it's like you're seeing, like the author just looked into your soul and put words to those feelings you couldn't describe.
Oh, I've totally been there. There's this one book, I'm not going to get into it all now, but it was like the author had been spying on my life or something. And it wasn't even specifically about trauma, but the way they talked about emotions, about relationships, it was like a light bulb. Finally, someone understood.
Walker actually says something similar about Walt Whitman's poetry. He talks about how Whitman's words, they gave him guidance, a feeling of belonging, almost like a map for life's tough stuff. And you saying you felt like that author was spying on you, that's basically what Walker felt with Whitman, like finding your people, but through their writing.
Like finding your tribe. But they're all just chilling in books.
Yeah.
And what's cool is that Walker doesn't just say, go read self-help. Those can be great too. He's into the power of stories, even if they're not about trauma directly. Stories that just nail the human experience in a way you connect with.
Exactly. He talks about authors like Alice Miller. Her stuff on childhood trauma is huge. And John Bradshaw, he's big on shame and family dynamics. But Walker's also like, find writers who speak to you. It's not one size fits all.
And that's where this whole bibliotherapy as a tool thing clicks. It's not therapy replacement, but it can be a powerful partner to it.
For sure. It's about empowering yourself,
Yeah.
with knowledge, different viewpoints, even that sense of community through shared experiences. Like, hey, you're not alone in this. And that's a good segue into Walker's whole recovery toolbox thing, right?
Yeah.
All these practical strategies for dealing with complex PTSD.
Yeah, and that's where we're headed next. We're going to dig into some of those specific tools Walker talks about, like boundaries, managing flashbacks, and how to actually use them in your life, like starting today. So we were just talking about reading as a healing tool, and that kind of takes us to Pete Walker's whole recovery toolbox idea. Now, obviously, it's not a real toolbox, but it's more like a collection of strategies he talks about.
Yeah, like a metaphorical toolbox,
Yeah.
right? Full of different ways to handle those complex PTSD hurdles.
Exactly. And one that really jumped out at me was Toolbox 1's suggested intentions for recovery. This one feels big because it's all about shifting that mindset from fear survival mode, which, let's be real, is huge with trauma,
Yeah.
to like hope and actually wanting things.
That's a massive change, right? Because when you've been living with that hypervigilance, always waiting for the crap to hit the fan, it's hard to imagine life beyond just getting by.
So true. And Walker gets that. He's not pretending it's easy, but he does lay out a path. Like,
Yeah.
he talks about self-compassion being so important because often people with complex PTSD are super hard on themselves.
Yeah, that inner critic's working overtime, right?
Oh, yeah.
Always pointing out flaws, past screw-ups, the whole 9 yards. So Walker's like, challenge that stuff. Swap those nasty thoughts with something supportive, something kinder.
Like realizing you deserve the same kindness you'd give someone else who's hurting. And from that self-compassion, you can be like, okay, what actually brings me joy? Walker's big on finding your passions, your values, even things you ditched because they felt too risky.
It's about reclaiming those lost parts of yourself, daring to dream again, and not just dreaming, but doing. Walker's all about action. Healing's not passive. It's about pushing yourself, even if it's scary, and going after what lights you up.
He also talks about healthy relationships, which I imagine is tough after relational trauma.
For sure. Trust is hard-earned when you've been hurt by people who should have had your back. So Walker talks about setting boundaries, recognizing red flags, basically building relationships that feel safe, supportive, the real deal.
And that actually, it perfectly leads into another toolbox, Toolbox 2, the Human Bill of Rights. This one hit home for me. It's about knowing your worth and those boundaries we were just saying.
Owning your power, basically. Because a lot of times with complex PTSD, people's boundaries have been, trampled on. So Walker's got this list of basic rights everyone gets, no matter what, like saying no without the guilt trip, messing up without the shame spiral, changing your mind. It sounds basic, but for someone struggling with people-pleasing, self-doubt, it's huge.
It's like he's giving you permission to put your well-being first, which can feel wild when you're used to putting everyone else ahead of yourself.
And it's not selfish. It's more like you can't give what you don't have. Got to take care of yourself to show up for others. And speaking of, those negative thought loops, there's a whole toolbox for that Toolbox 3, responses to critic attacks.
Makes sense because, like we've been saying, that inner critic can be brutal, especially during healing.
Totally. And Walker doesn't just say, think happy thoughts. He gives you ways to pinpoint those nasty thoughts, question if they're even true, and reframe them more realistically, more kindly.
Like he talks about all or nothing thinking, right? Seeing things in black and white. One mistake, you're a failure. Not perfect, not worthy of love. Walker's like, see that pattern, now challenge it.
Finding that middle ground. He also talks about separating perfectionism, which is often fear and shame in disguise, from actual danger. Because when you're in survival mode, it's easy to think every little thing is life or death.
Learning to tell the difference between what's truly harmful and what's just your inner critic being a buzzkill, keeping you small and safe, even if that safety is holding you back.
Exactly. And lastly, I got to mention Toolbox 6, managing flashbacks. Because for a lot of people, flashbacks are just debilitating, triggered by random stuff, throwing you back into that fear and helplessness.
It's like your body's reliving the trauma, even though your brain knows you're safe now.
Totally. Walker's big on this. Flashbacks are normal. It's your body reacting to the trauma. But you don't have to let them control you. He's got all these grounding techniques, ways to self-soothe, cope, like deep breathing, using your senses to ground yourself, asking for support. These can make a huge difference in getting back that control during a flashback.
Reminding yourself you're not powerless, even when it feels that way. And as we wrap up our deep dive into Walker's work, I think the biggest takeaway is that healing isn't a straight line. There will be ups, downs, setbacks, moments of, what the heck am I doing? But Walker gives us the framework, a whole toolbox of resources, and maybe most importantly, hope.
He reminds us we can heal, that our trauma doesn't define us. We've got this strength, this resilience to get better, to create a better future.
And one of the strongest things he says is to be kind to yourself throughout all of this. So as you explore these tools, as you walk your own path to healing, go easy on yourself, celebrate those wins, no matter how small, and never ever give up hope.